Recording. Yeah. So, hi everyone, welcome to our crypto seminar. Today we have Jiaxin from Princeton University, and he's going to talk about his work in Incompressible Cryptography. Let's welcome.
Thank you, Claire, for the introduction. So my name is Jiaxin Guan, and today I'll be talking about our work, Incompressible Cryptography. This is a joint work with Mark Zandri and Daniel Wicks, and this work is to appear in this year's Europe. So in today's talk, I'm going to break into a couple of parts. So first of all, we're going to walk over some motivations for this study, and then we're going to look at how we define incompressible cryptography. And at the end, if time allowing, I'm going to go over a few constructions that we did. Okay, so in cryptography, we have so in cryptography, we have our favorite friends, Alice and Bob, and they love to do a lot of crazy looking protocols. But let's say they're doing a very simple thing. So Alice is sending over an encrypted document over to Bob. Very standard, just standard. It can be symmetric or PKE. Doesn't really matter here. And here comes our favorite adversary, Eve. Suppose for now Eve is an eavesdropper and eavesdrops on the channel. And what Eve can do is that Eve can make a copy of the encrypted document, but Eve cannot decrypt it because the document is encrypted. Then assume that at a later time, maybe a day later, or maybe 20 days later, or maybe a year later, or 20 years later, Eve is able to somehow get hold of the secret key that's used to decrypt. So you can think about it either through a security breach or through social engineering, or maybe even by like physically interrogating Bob. Who knows? Okay, so with this secret key, then what the adversary can do is can simply use the actual secret key to decrypt the document and get the original message. Right? So to protect against these sort of attacks, what we want is what we call forward secrecy. Essentially, we want that the security of previous messages is not compromised even after a security breach happens at a later time. And in a standard model, if we want to achieve forward secrecy, we would either need to construct multi-round protocols, which requires the sender and the receiver to communicate back and forth, or we will require the two parties to update their keys very often. And both of these could be undesirable under many scenarios. In a slightly different scenario, not so different. I mean, Alice and Bob is sending an encrypted document, comes to eavesdropper Eve, makes a copy of the document. And then at a later time, Eve is going to interrogate Bob and ask Bob for a secret key. But this time, instead of providing the actual secret key, what Bob does is that Bob provides a fake secret key, which causes the message to decrypt as well. It successfully decrypts, but this time to a fake message. For example, to a cute picture of a cat. Okay, so this is what we call receiver deniable encryption. Yeah, let's do this part.
More. You can put more. And then hide video. High floating.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so we got a cute picture of a cat. So yeah, you just stare at it for the last 20 seconds. So yeah. Okay. So so receiver deniable encryption. Essentially, we want that the receiver is able to provide a fake secret key, which can cause the message to still successfully decrypt, but instead to a fake message. And in fact, it has been shown that it is the receiver deniable encryption is impossible in the standard model.
Question?
Yeah.
So can the receiver choose what kind of fake message, or it just becomes truly random?
Just a different message than the original message, but yeah.
The receiver can choose what kind of message.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. So and then let's take a look at the last example. So this time, say Alice is holding a party at her place at the Friday night, and Alice wants to invite Bob over, so she sends over a message saying there's a party happening tonight. And to convince Bob that this message actually comes from Alice, so Alice attaches a signature, very standard crypto practice. And comes our eavesdropper Eve, who again makes a copy of the message together with a signature. But Eve doesn't do anything malicious yet. But at a later time, say it's Monday night, when everybody is working, supposedly, Eve is gonna forward the message together with a signature over to Bob. And then Bob on Monday receives a message from Alice saying there's a party tonight. Bob verifies a signature, and indeed it's a valid signature from Alice. And Bob going to Alice's place only to find out there's no party at all. So this is what we call a replay attack. And to protect against these replay attacks, there's a couple of options. We either make the frog go multiple rounds, or we can have Alice and Bob to maintain a synchronized clock, and they would include the clock information within the signature. Or we will require the verifier, Bob, here to keep us state. Again, all of these could be undesirable under many scenarios. So here we ask a hypothetical question. So what if the adversary cannot store the ciphertext or the signature? So suppose that you send some ciphertext, you send some signature, it's just like through some magic that the adversary cannot store it. What's going to happen in this case? Okay, so in the encryption case, Alice is going to send over an encrypted document over to Bob, and the eavesdropper Eve, maybe you can look at the document as it's being sent. But once after transmission is over, eavesdropper Eve cannot store anything of the cannot store the ciphertext. Okay. So then at a later time, even if Eve is given the actual decryption key, there's nothing Eve can do because there's no ciphertext to work with. Notice that this is vacuously receiver deniable because there's no message for it to deny at all. Okay. Yeah, so similar is also the case for signatures. So we send over a signature and eavesdropper Eve. And after transmission is over, the signature disappears, leaving only the original message. And then there's no way for eavesdropper Eve to come up with a signature just by itself. Okay. So how exactly might we achieve something like this? So what is the magic needed to make this happen? So the key idea under our construction is that we want to manually blow up the ciphertext. So you might have a small ciphertext. You might have a small message. The idea is that we want to manually blow up that small message to a huge ciphertext that exceeds the adversary's capability to store. So you have a small message, you blow it up to a huge ciphertext so that the adversary cannot store the entire ciphertext. The adversary might be able to store a portion of it, but we want that even if the adversary has a portion of the ciphertext, the adversary it is equivalent as storing them.
Just one question. So if the ciphertext is too large, how can Bob decrypt it?
Oh, yeah. So Bob, the honest parties can do this in a streaming manner. Yes.
Then why can't the adversary do it in a streaming manner?
No, but remember, you have to store the entire message because you don't get the secret key until a later time. So say I'm sending this message to you, and you are decrypting bit by bit as I'm sending the message. But then 10 years later, I reveal the secret key, but then you would no longer have the message. Yeah. Okay. So in fact, this idea has been studied in our previous paper, Disappearing Cryptography in the Bounded Storage Model. This work is set in the bounded storage model, which is first put forward by Ulimura in 1992, which allows us to restrict the adversary's ability to store the ciphertext. So what is a bounded storage model? Well, traditionally in cryptography, when we talk about an adversary, we imagine the adversary to be time bounded. So the adversary needs to carry out the attack under a polytime. However, in the bounded storage model, we imagine the adversary the attack can take as long as it wants, but the adversary, throughout the entire attack, the adversary is bounded by some space bound that's usually said to be a fixed polynomial p on the security parameter n. So usually, a lot of the constructions there, p of n is equal to n squared. So the security parameter n is the honest party's storage. Like the honest parties run the protocol using space n, whereas the whole protocol is secure as long as the adversary only uses up to n squared bits of memory. If you think about this, n and n squared doesn't seem like a huge gap, but if you set n to be around, let's say, 5 gigabytes, and n squared would be around like 5 ZB, which already exceeds the total amount of storage in the data center around 2021. So yeah. So previously in the bounded storage model, there has been a lineup of interesting work constructing CPA encryption, commitment, key agreements, OTE protocols, and timestamping. And most of the work has been trying to use bounded storage model just by itself to achieve information theoretical results. So back to this paper, disappearing cryptography in a bounded storage model. So the idea is that, right, so we set the message size or the signature, we set the ciphertext size or the signature size to be larger than the adversary storage bound so that the adversary cannot store it. So with that in mind, with that intuition in mind, we are gonna quickly take a look at how we define security under these scenarios. So here is a plain PKE security definition. So you can imagine Bob samples a public key security pair together with a challenge bit B, and he sends over the public key over to the adversary. And the adversary sends over challenge messages M0 and M1, and the challenger is going to encrypt a random 1 according to the challenge bit B. And at the end, the adversary needs to make a guess for the bit B, and the adversary succeeds. And the adversary succeeds if the guess is correct. Okay. So as we said, so the idea here is that we set the adversary to be under a space-bound S. So the adversary throughout the entire attack is bounded by a space S, and we set the ciphertext to be much larger than space S. Okay. So that means when the ciphertext is being sent over to the adversary cannot write it down. So now with that, we're able to grant we're going to be able to add additional things to the experiment. In fact, we can have the challenger send over the actual secret key over to Bob. So if you think about this, even with the private key, Bob cannot, the adversary cannot make a correct guess for B prime. So why is that? So this is just impossible in the standard model if you don't have a bound on the adversary storage, because you have the secret key, you just use it to decrypt the ciphertext. But here the idea is that ciphertext is so large you cannot write it down. Then at a later time, it's okay to actually give you this. Okay, so this is how we define PKE in the bounded storage model for disappearing PKE in the bounded storage model. And similarly, we would define signatures. So the challenger has a key pair and sends over the public key, and the adversary is allowed to query a whole bunch of messages and get corresponding signatures. So that's the standard signature forgery experiment. And at the end, the adversary is required to output a valid message signature pair for any message that has not seen before. So this is in the standard model. But here again, remember, we're bounding the adversary space and we are setting the signature to be larger than the adversary storage. So you can never write down a single signature. So now we loosen the requirement to say that it's actually okay for you to produce a signature on any message, even if you heard that message before. Even if you heard it before, you cannot write it down. So if you are not able to produce a valid signature, but that means you're able to do the forgery instead of like just copy pasting the previous signature. So this is how a signature scheme is defined for disappearing cryptography in the bounded storage. So now you might be asking, okay, so we've been seeing a few slides about disappearing cryptography. So how is it different from incompressible cryptography? So the key difference here is the memory bound. So notice that the disappearing crypto is set in the bounded storage model, which means that throughout the entire time, the adversary is bounded by the space S. But that is not really very, it doesn't capture some types of attacks. For example, if you think about this, storing, say, it's okay for me to store 10 gigabytes. If you ask me to store 10 gigabytes right now, I'm okay to do so. But if you ask me to store 10 gigabytes maybe for 10 years, I say, okay, that's too much burden for my hard disk, right? So you really want to, what we really want to bound is the adversary's long-term storage. Really short-term, ask you to store 10 gigabytes or maybe 100 gigabytes is okay, right? So imagine these two following adversaries. So the first adversary, so the x-axis is the time and the y-axis is the storage. So the first adversary, when the transmission is happening, sort of writes down writes down the transmission bit by bit, so the storage really spikes. But after the transmission is over, the adversary does some processing and compresses down the entire thing, the entire conversation to a smaller state, and that smaller state is what the adversary will store over maybe the time before a security breach happens, right? And the second adversary, it would just a more naive adversary that just like writes down information bit by bit, and then just keeps that memory state throughout the entire time. So now, if we set the memory bound S in a bounded storage model to be somewhere between the maximum and the long-term storage, we'll notice that the adversary on the left is not a valid bounded storage model adversary, because it exceeds the memory bound. However, it's a totally legit adversary. It's a totally legit attack strategy. So, in incompressible cryptography, we want to capture the adversaries on the left as well. So in incompressible cryptography, we're giving the adversary more power, leading to a strictly stronger security model. Okay. So before we jump back to the actually our work of incompressible cryptography, I want to quickly go over some other related work that's related to incompressible cryptography. So first of all, there is big key cryptography in the bounded retrieval model. So the bounded retrieval model is where we bound the amount of bits leaked, the amount of leakage of the ciphertext. And but the work there, the idea is to set the secret key size to be large, whereas we ideally want a small ciphertext. But in our case, it's actually the opposite. We want to have huge ciphertext and signatures, but ideally keeping the secret key size to be small. So their work there doesn't really carry over to incompressible cryptography.
I just have a question. Like, how practical are these schemes? Like, can they be used on these IoT devices that they have bounded storage? Like,
oh, depending on how what would you want to set the bound to be? Because because the whole thing about bounded storage model is that the communication cost is going to be larger than the space bound. So if you want your space bound to be, say, 10 terabytes, then for the communication you will need to send terabytes of data.
So it's not designed for these like weak devices. It's not designed for like powerful. I mean, I don't understand the intended scenario.
Yeah, if the honest users are like, if the honest users are IoT devices, then the adversary can probably just get over by using like a few gigabytes of memory. So
it could be like basically used by these weak devices like IoT.
Well, I mean, it's depending on the threat model, right? If you're like, if you have like the honest users are IoT devices, but if your adversary is like, say, Google level adversaries, then the whole thing is just.
And what about the case when let's say the adversary?
The adversary is also IoT devices. Yeah, that's a valid like.
And the honest devices are also IoT.
Yeah, yeah. That's a very good.
Things like can they actually already be designed for
Yeah, I don't know the state of it. Yeah, but yeah, for those scenarios where like space is really hard to get, yeah, this is a very valid application. Okay, so some other related work is there has been some study of these that captures this idea of leaking bits of a ciphertext, but all of this work has been in a symmetric key setting. So the work by Ravis in 1997 studies all or nothing encryption, where it's a symmetric key encryption scheme, where even knowing a few bits of the ciphertext, and then at a later time getting the secret key doesn't reveal information about the message. So like getting several bits of the ciphertext together with a secret key doesn't reveal anything about the message. And there's a stronger version of this called forward secure encryption, put forward by Ziembowski, The idea here is that instead of remembering several bits of the ciphertext, you're able to compute a function on the ciphertext, which has a small output. So in other words, you're able to like somehow run some processing on the ciphertext and compress it down to a smaller state. So and then you're given the secret key, and we want to show that you don't reveal anything about the message. So actually, or nothing encryption is sort of like disappearing cryptography in the symmetric key setting, and forward secure encryption is more like incompressible cryptography in the symmetric key setting. And following up on the or nothing encryption, Zavarucha built a password-based encryption scheme, which is later shown that if you combine it together with an external memory hard function, you can have memory hard encryption, which allows you to have large memory bounds even if the blocks are even if the block size is small. However, these are all in the symmetric key setting, and it is not obvious how they would carry over to the public key setting.
So these adversaries are only like bounded in storage, but not bounded in time.
Not bounded in time.
So why can't they just do a brute force that when I get the secret key?
So that's why. Actually, I'm not sure about the constructions here, but which one specifically are you?
Let's say just encryption, because let's say the
So traditionally in a bounded storage model, it's being used to do information theoretical security. So there, the adversary can take as long as it wants because the things are information theoretically hidden. So like you can think about an OTP, right? So if you have a one-time pad, then even the adversary has unlimited amount of time, you can't break it.
Yeah.
Right? But for the I should probably clarify this. So for the disappearing cryptography in the bounded storage model, it is set in the bounded storage model, but together we need computational assumptions. Yes, that's a good point. Yeah, forgot to mention that. Yes.
So also the running time is bounded, right? The adversary.
The adversary is in other words, the adversary is time bounded and space bounded.
Okay.
Yes. Right. So yeah, so now let's get back to our topic today, incompressible cryptography. So how do we define incompressible cryptography? We want to capture these sort of adversaries that compresses the whole thing down to a smaller state, and then later on use that smaller state to break the scheme, right? So quickly, we'll just reproduce the disappearing PKE security, right? And see how we modify it to incompressible PKE security. So first of all, we're no longer in the bounded storage model, so we remove the space bound. However, we will now break the adversary into two parts, and these two adversaries do not communicate with each other. They don't have any secret channels between them. Okay. So the first adversary is gonna run a whole bunch of challenges. Here is just one challenge message and get back the corresponding response, and compresses the whole ciphertext down to a state ST, such that the state is bounded by the space S. Okay. And notice that throughout this entire time, this adversary can take as much space as it wants. There's no space bounded. However, notice that throughout the whole thing, the adversaries are still computationally bounded. And then the state is passed along to the second adversary together with some other metadata, and the second adversary needs to carry out the attack and make a guess for the bit B. Yes.
So can you repeat again what is the bound here? I mean, is there a bound on the space?
The bound is only on the state, like the state ST. Yeah, it's a bound on space, but notice that it is not throughout the entire game. Like, so the only restriction is that here the variable ST is less than size S.
So is the second adversary time bounded?
Yes.
So the second one is not space bound.
The second one is not space bounded at all. So both adversaries are not bounded by space. They are bounded by time. The only thing that is bounded by space is the state ST.
Wait, sorry. So the first.
This confuses me.
So the first one is also not bounded by time.
No, both adversaries are bounded by
So
time.
both are bounded.
Yeah, but both are not bounded by space.
So it's not strictly stronger than the previous definition because the previous definition doesn't impose a bound on time.
No, sorry. So it's not stronger than bounded search model, but for disappearing cryptography, we have bound on time.
What's the difference between disappearing cryptography and
Okay,
bounded storage?
Yeah, so let me go back to the. Okay, so disappearing PKE here, right?
Mhm.
Okay, yeah, so this whole thing, like throughout the entire time, the adversary is bounded by space X, but the adversary is also bounded by computational assumptions.
So what do you mean by time?
Sorry, what?
So here the adversary is bounded by.
Is bounded by time as well, yes. Yeah, so the computational assumptions are not inherent in the bounded storage model, so they are added onto the bounded storage model to achieve our construction.
So that's the only difference between disappearing crypto and bounded storage? Like I just wonder, I'm
Yeah,
confused
yeah,
about the name.
yeah,
Okay, I see.
Yeah, okay, so disappearing PKE is set in the bounded storage model, and bounded storage model there, you only have a space bound on the adversary, no computational assumptions, but we show that if you combine the bounded storage model together with computational assumptions, we're able to achieve this disappearing PKE. And that is a result not possible in the standard model with only computational assumptions. That makes sense? Okay. So,
One last question.
yeah.
Like this bound on ST is not bound on storage.
The bound on ST is the bound on what?
ST is not storage here, state.
ST, the state is on the bound is on its sides. In other words, like the storage. The state ST, yeah.
Okay. So there is some sort of bound. on the
There is
storage.
some sort of bound, but it's like only for long-term storage, right? So there's still a space bound there, but it's no longer in the bounded storage model. The bounded storage model would require the adversary to be low space throughout the entire time. But here the
I
adversary,
see. So if you execute multiple rounds, you can override this data maybe, or you can write only on state. This is your only.
yeah, this is your only like long-term storage. This is all. So the only way that the adversary 1 is able to talk to adversary 2 is by storing things into the state ST. There's no other way for adversary 1 to communicate anything to adversary 2.
How is long-term defined? Like protocols interactive, is there like bounds on sort of?
Oh, there's no bound on time. Yeah, there's no bound on like how long it's for. It's just like we break the experiment into 2 parts. Like you submit your challenge messages, receive responses, submit the state, and then the state is sent to the second adversary. This can happen like just like together. This doesn't necessarily need to have a time separation between them.
Why are the two adversaries not interact?
Because if they interact with each other, then the first adversary can potentially, because the first adversary doesn't have any storage bound, right? So the first adversary can just send over the entire ciphertext over to the second adversary. So we want to prevent against those. That makes sense? Yeah, try to convince yourself that this captures our the intuition that we want to allow for these like long-term storages, whereas for the short-term memories, you can use as much short-term memory as you want. Okay. Yeah, and yeah, notice that here the security definition is strictly stronger than that of a disappearing cryptography. So an incompressible PKE actually security-wise implies disappearing PKE. Okay, and for incompressible signature, it's a similar thing. So we'll send over the public key to the first adversary, and the first adversary can submit queries on a whole bunch of messages and get corresponding signatures. But after that, the first adversary needs to compress everything down to the state ST. And then the second adversary is given the state ST together with the metadata, and then the second adversary needs to produce the forgery. Okay, so whoever does the challenges doesn't perform the actual attack, and whoever performs the actual attack only gets the small state as it is. Okay, and again, this security definition is strictly stronger than disappearing signatures. So an incompressible signature scheme also implies a disappearing signature security. Okay. So notice that I've been saying that when I say this implies, I say that the security-wise, an incompressible signature implies disappearing signature, because it's really important that it's security-wise. Because if you think about this, the bounded storage model actually requires the honest parties to carry out the protocols under low space. However, when we remove the bounded storage model from our definitions, we're sort of lifting this requirement as well. So in other words, in incompressible cryptography, a honest party can potentially need a huge amount of space to run the protocol, which will make that honest party not work as a honest party in a bounded storage model. So functionality-wise, the incompressible cryptography might not be as expressive as the disappearing cryptography because of this restriction. However, we show that two of our constructions, encryption, decryption, signing, and verifying, so in other words, all the honest parties can run in low space. So with this additional feature, if you have an incompressible PKE and you have that this incompressible PKE supports low space streaming, meaning that the sender and the verifier can carry out encrypt and decrypt in low space, then that scheme would imply that that scheme is a disappearing PKE. Does that make sense? So security-wise, strictly stronger, but for functionality-wise, you need this additional low space streaming feature.
This basically means that if the adversary is unbounded, he can also brute force in a streaming way, fashion and decrypt, right? If we allow the adversary to be unbounded. I mean,
the adversary is unbounded, no, but you cannot brute force because the adversary still needs to compress down to a small state. The security definition is not modified. We're only modifying the. In other words, like the additional feature is that encrypt and decrypt can run in low space. So, yeah, it's not changing how we define security.
I thought you had to relax from information theoretic security down to.
So the thing here are not information theoretic because we require computational assumptions.
So then why can we not do the brute force attack?
Oh, so how do you brute force?
Just like, since it's not information theoretic, just trying to.
in a streaming fashion.
No, but we have computational assumptions about the adversary.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Yeah, so the adversary is both time bounded and space bounded.
But you can take any amount of time to generate, like to decide on the state.
No, that's still time bounded. Yeah. So both adversaries are time bounded, not space bounded, but the state is bounded by the storage S.
So actually, I have a question. We have the security definition of signature
Sure.
scheme.
Yeah.
So the second adversary only just the second adversary.
Yeah.
Not encryption, signature scheme.
Oh, signature, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So the second adversary only gets messages, not the signatures.
Not the signatures,
as Maynard
yes.
did that.
Correct. Because the signature, if we receive a signature, you can just send that signature over, and that will be a valid forgery. Notice that because when we move to disappearing signatures, you like the forgeries you produce can be on a message that you have queried before.
So what if we require that it cannot be message you queried before?
Then that's just a plain model, that's just a standard model signature scheme. Right, that's how standard model signature forgeries are defined. Like you produce a signature on a message you haven't seen before. But here you produce a message on any message. Then you produce a signature on any message. Yeah, so that's why here you can't be given the second message can't be given the signatures.
Only the signature.
And then here, MI should be SK, right?
MI. Oh yeah, you should.
It should be SK.
No, you should have given the SK because for signing, if you're given the SK, you can sign any message, right? For signature.
It depends on how big your signature is. If the signature itself is bigger than S, then maybe you still cannot work.
The signature, like single signature is larger than S, but I mean, you require a single signature to be larger than S, because if a single signature is smaller than S, then you can just write that signature down into the state, right?
So, okay, so it has to be larger than S, and then I guess why do you need this extra S? Like, I guess you're not giving it this signature. I mean, you cannot give it the signature anywhere.
Yeah, you can't give the signature anywhere. Yes. And you can't give the secret key because with the secret key you can sign anything, right? Like just as in the standard model signature scheme, you're not given the secret key because with the secret key you can just run the sign.
So what is the point of MI here when
Honestly, like I don't know how it's gonna help the adversary, but giving it doesn't still make the security.
So you can just give it the state and the
So
public.
you just give it to the corporate, and so that for example, the first adversary could like query specific messages, and yeah, we can because the adversary don't have any ways to communicate, we can have the second adversary communicate to the first bedroom. Yes. So yeah, so here's another thing I want to define, which is called the rate. So if you think about this, as we talked about earlier, the idea is that you take a small message and you blow it up to a huge ciphertext or signature. Now, what if your message itself is already huge? You're gonna take, if you use the same scheme, right? You're gonna take that huge message and you're gonna blow it up to a gigantic ciphertext or signature, which is just going to be super unbreakable, right? Okay, so yeah, so what we really want is that we want the overhead to be as small as possible. So this is how we define the rate. So if you have a PKE scheme, we can imagine the rate being the message size over the ciphertext size. So if you have a small message and a huge ciphertext, the rate is going to be low. Okay. And similarly, we define the rate for signature. So you might think, but like, okay, so we can define it just as message size over signature size. But remember, signature size can be independent of the message size. And what we actually want to capture here is the overhead added on to the entire communication. But remember, when you're sending over a signature, you're sending it together along with the original message, right? So it doesn't really capture like the overhead added. So then we might think, okay, so you might just do message size over message size plus signature size. But here, notice that we're constructing incompressible signatures. So the signature itself is incompressible. But remember, the message itself could be compressible. Say like you have a 1,000-bit message, but the message is just all zeros, right? It might seem that, right? So we want to capture that. Yeah, if you have 1,000 bits of zero and then the signature, you have an incompressible signature, it doesn't really matter because you can still compress the whole message down to a smaller compressed message, right? So that still doesn't work. So we want to capture the idea of incompressibility and the ideal rate together. So here's like we abuse syntax and redefine the signature syntax a little bit. So now when you're assigning a message using the secret key SK, now imagine that you get a large signature sigma prime, which sort of embeds the original message in there. So it's sort of a signature together with the original message. And then when you're verifying, all you need is just a single signature sigma prime. And then it's gonna, if it verifies, it's gonna give you the original message. If it doesn't verify, it tells you that it doesn't verify. So notice that this just captures the original signature syntax. All you need to do is define sigma prime to consist of the original message concatenated with the signature. So notice that this is, this syntax just captures the traditional signature syntax. But here, you can have sigma prime being just message concatenated with sigma, or they can be encoded in some more clever way. Does that make sense? Yeah. So with this amended syntax, we define the rate to be the message size over this large signature sigma prime size, which sort of already embeds the message in there. So that allows us to capture sort of the overhead you're adding on by doing incompressible signature. Yeah, so remember back then when I said the key idea is to manually blow up the ciphertext or signature size, well, that's actually a lie because you're not really blowing up the size, but you're blowing up the entropy in the original message. Because you can potentially, ideally what we want is a rate 1, which means for PKE scheme, your message is almost as large as a ciphertext, and for signatures, your message is almost as long as a signature. So what scenarios are we considering here? Like say if we know the absolute bound is some split, say if we know that the bound on the state is some say fixed amount. The question is how large of a message can we encrypt there, right? So here with a rate 1 scheme, it says that you can encrypt a message almost as large as that bound. Does that make sense? So in other, yeah.
So with your previous signature definition,
Yes.
you also allowed the adversary to store or the first adversary to send a message as well as their state. So if this size of the message is roughly the size of the signature, wouldn't that allow them to send pretty much a signature there?
So wait, say that again. Sorry.
So in your disappearing or your incompressible signature security definition, adversary 1 would send some state as well as some message to
Yes.
adversary 2.
Yes.
But if the message is about the same size as the signature,
Oh, I
would
see.
that allow
I
them
see.
to send?
Yeah. So the message parts are going to be non-adaptive. So you cannot write the ciphertext. So you cannot write a signature into the. So I guess the attack you were imagining is that the adversary sends over a message, gets a signature, and sends that signature as the second message query.
Yeah,
And then that's get fed onto the second adversary. No, we require that the queries to be non-adaptive, so you cannot get free storage by putting your signatures in the message. Yeah, but that's a good point. Yes. Okay. So so the idea is that here, if you think about you're streaming a video, right? The idea is that a video is probably already a huge size. Then like you don't need any overhead. You just like the encrypted video is just like roughly the same size as the original video, and it already fulfills the incompressible cryptography requirement.
So, but if you don't give it the message to the second adversary, you don't have that adaptivity problem.
If you don't give you don't have that.
So does this adaptivity being make you weaker than the, like not incomparable to this disappearing crypto?
That's a good point. Yes, in that sense, I think so. Yeah, but if you define it, you can take out the message, and then you don't have such a.
So if you remove the message from the definition, you can still secure, then you can be adaptive.
I mean, if you remove the message to the second adversary, like it's a weaker. It's a weaker model because
But in that case, you can prove adaptive security.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I was being a little bit slack on when I say that it implies. Okay, does that make sense? Cool. So so in this work we study incompressible cryptography. We define a incompressible PKE, and we show that we show several constructions. So we first of all show that you can construct an incompressible PKE, which is low rate, that you can construct from standard model PKE alone. So that's so that's like minimal amount of assumptions. We actually don't show that's a minimal, but it's a very reasonable assumption, as you can see. And in fact, for incompressible signatures, we show that you can get from one-way functions. And both of these constructions supports low space streaming. So the honest parties can just use the honest parties can carry out the whole thing using low space compared to the adversary state. And we also construct incompressible PKE, which has an optimal rate of 1, which says that the message size can be almost as large as the ciphertext size, together with incompressible signature. So the incompressible PKE construction is based on indistinguishability obfuscation (IO), and incompressible signatures. We actually show that. Notice that it's a bidirectional arrow. We actually show that incompressible signature is equivalent to incompressible encodings, which was put forward by Mora and Wicks in 2020. Okay. So in the last couple of minutes, we're going to take a quick look at some of the constructions. So before that, just quickly summarize how incompressible crypto is different from disappearing crypto. Right, so disappearing cryptography, the whole thing is in the bounded storage model. So you are bounded by space S throughout the entire time. But for incompressible, you're only bounded by space S for the storage, which is the size of the state. And in disappearing cryptography, well, the honest parties operate at the lower bound, whereas in incompressible cryptography, the model is the definition itself inherently doesn't have this requirement. However, we show that there are this feature, low space streaming feature, which allows the protocol to be carried out, whereas the honest parties only use low space. And disappearing cryptography, the message ciphertext size is really low. Like you have a small message, you have with a huge ciphertext. And in here, we show that you're able to achieve a optimal rate of 1. And disappearing cryptography is based on something called online obfuscation, which is sort of VGB obfuscation in the bounded storage model. So it's sort of like VGB is stronger than IO, but weaker than VGB. Yeah, but it's a pretty strong assumption there. And in here, it's based on much weaker assumptions. Okay, so how exactly do we do this? So first of all, I want to convince you that it's
So
not.
can you go back to that?
Yeah.
I'm confused again. Are you saying the previous constructions in obfuscation? I mean, yours imply in disappearing.
Yeah, ours imply disappearing cryptography.
So this is not like a law about for disappearing. It's just that you're saying previous constructions rely on.
Previous construction rely on obfuscation. Yes, it's not a logam.
I see.
So like we're improving over the previous result. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so how exactly do we do this? So first of all, I want to convince you that it's not a very trivial thing. Like, first of all, I want to show that like traditional PKEs, they are not incompressible. So a traditional way to construct PKE is using a hybrid scheme, right? So you have use a PKE scheme to encrypt the key needed for a symmetric key encryption. So for example, here, let's say you use the public keys to encrypt message. You will sample a symmetric seed S, and you would essentially encrypt the message using a PRG with the seed S as the input, and you would encrypt the seed using the public key. And your ciphertext is just the one-time pad output, the one-time pad encryption of the message together with the encryption of the seed S, right? So that's like a standard hybrid PKE scheme. And yeah, when you decrypt, right, you decrypt the seed S, and then you use the seed, feed it into the PRG, and you one-time pad and get the autonomous.
I guess I'm still confused. Like you also mentioned this bounded storage model
Yes.
earlier. So
Yes.
like for bounded storage model, what are the results like? That's an even stronger model than disappearing cryptography, right?
No, bounded storage model is the model that the disappearing cryptography is set in, but the disappearing cryptography combines bounded storage model together with computational assumptions.
And so bounded storage doesn't allow computational assumptions.
Doesn't allow, I
Is
mean,
it-
it's not like it doesn't allow, it doesn't assume a computational assumption.
Okay, so is it impossible to get these like security and PKE? It's not.
Security of PKE,
Yeah.
just in the bounded storage model without computational assumptions.
Yeah, that's impossible.
That's, I think it's impossible, because if you're computationally, unbounded, then you can just brute force the whole thing. I think, yes. Does that make sense? Like bounded storage model is more of the model, like disappearing cryptography is more about like the security definitions there.
But for symmetric key, it's possible.
For symmetric key, yes, the previous works are, yeah. But like the all or nothing encryption, they are information key, right?
I see.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, so this is a pretty standard hybrid PKE, and all right. So now imagine, so this is not incompressible because there's an easy way to attack this, right? So so what you do is you can write down the ciphertext, the encryption of the seed, together with just a couple of bits of the one-time pad encryption, not in its entirety. This is going to take you some low space, and then later on, when you're given the secret key, use the secret key to decrypt the encryption, and you get back the seed, and then you just run the seed, you run the PRG and get back a couple of bits of Z. Sorry, a couple of and then you just run the PRG and XOR it with a couple of bits of Z that you've stored, and you are able to get just a couple of bits of message now, which already breaks incompressibility. Of course, you can still replace this underlying encryption method. Say you don't want to do a PRG and then one-time pad. Say, for example, you want to do some block cipher with CBC mode or counter mode. But for counter mode, you can instead of writing down Z here, you write down the initial value, the IV block. And for the CBC, remember that the encryption is still local. Like if you store one block, you're able to later on break the couple of blocks after it. Okay, so yeah, so so just naively combining just 9 PKEs that are non-incompressible. So next we're going to see quickly how we construct incompressible signatures. So the construction is really straightforward, very intuitive. So to construct the incompressible signature, when you're signing a message, right? So you first of all sample your key pairs, public key, secret key pairs, send over to Bob. And if you're assigning a message M, what you will do is you will sample another long randomness R. And when you sign the message, you just combine this long random R together with your message, and you sign the randomness concatenated with the message M. And that's going to be your signature. And you send over the original message together with the long randomness R. And to verify, right, you concatenate the long randomness R together with the message, and then you do the verification. Does that make sense? So if you think about this, now why is this incompressible, right? If you later on want to produce a forgery, you will need to write down the entire randomness R. If you don't have the entire randomness R, that means you're able to sign on some other R prime, which essentially means you break the underlying signatures. So that makes sense? So if you think about this, the idea here is that you're using, by concatenating M with this long random R, you're sort of creating an encoding, an incompressible encoding of the original message. The issue is that here, this incompressible encoding is of a very bad grade, because you're just concatenating along with a super long randomness. So then we show that, yeah, if you do it more cleverly by using the incompressible encoding construction by more and weights, it's actually equivalent. Like a incompressible signature is equivalent to an incompressible encoding. Okay, so but the whole idea is here, yeah, this RAM is acting as an incompressible encoding, but you want to make it a better rate, and just by making a better rate, you get the rate 170. All right. So next, we're going to quickly take a look at how we construct incompressible PKE. I think we're almost out of time, so we're going to look at an intuition of it. We're not going to go into the actual construction, but the intuition is also pretty straightforward. So Alice has a public key secret key pair and sends over the public key to Bob, and Bob wants to send over a message M over to Alice. Okay, so it's quite like the hybrid scheme that I talked a minutes earlier. So what Bob will do is sample a seed S for an extractor together with a long random R. Okay, and it's going to compute a one-time pass. So it's going to run the extractor using the long random R and together with the seed S, and use the extractor output as a one-time path for the original message M. And let's call the value Z, and then it's going to encrypt the extractor seed using the public key. Okay, and then it's going to send over this tuple consisting of the long random R together with the one-time pad encryption together with the ciphertext, the encryption of the seed S. And when you receive the whole thing, right, you first of all decrypt the ciphertext to get back the original seed. And then you run your seed on the extractor R, and then you XOR the result with the value Z, and you get back the original message. So how is this like low space streaming? Well, all you need to do is to make this extractor an online extractor, which runs in low space. So if your extractor here is an online extractor, notice that the whole thing can be easily run in low space, right? If you just run the extractor in low space, because the only thing that's big here is the randomness R. Okay, so intuitively, this is secure, right? I mean, intuitively, because you have this long random R, and this long random R sort of like protects because you cannot write down this entire random R. Like later on, how would you be able to reproduce the extractor output? So the actual construction is more complicated than this because in order for the hybrid proofs to go through, but this is sort of captures the main intuition behind this. Okay, so yeah, sort of have so the actual construction requires functional encryption and yeah, it's you can see it's slightly more complicated in order for the it looks a lot complicated, it's just slightly complicated.
So can you functional encryption even for the long range one?
Even for the long range one, but it's a functional okay, so it's a functional encryption for this specific type of functions. Like this type of functions where it has a hard-coded value v in there. So it takes a flag. If the flag is 0, it gives you back the original message. If the flag is 1, it gives you an XOR of X and E. And we show that this specific type of functional encryption, they can be constructed using standard model behavior. This is a very restricted class of functional encryption. Yeah. So yeah, it's yeah, you can see it's slightly more complicated, and yeah, in order for the hybrid proof to go through. So yeah, I don't think we're gonna have time for that. So
the extractor based one is single time or
is what?
One round, like it's for one message, or
It's for
is it multi-round?
for one message. I mean here, like the security is defined like where the answer only occurs one message.
Okay. So what is the addition about functional encryption? Why is it functional encryption?
Oh, the functional encryption is yeah. So the functional encryption is we only need like single key semi-adaptive functional encryption, and the idea is that when you're encrypting, you don't want to just directly encrypt the original seed S. If you just directly encrypt the seed S, right? So you still have something that's dependent on the seed S, and in the hybrid proof, when you're trying to switch the extractor to a true random output, the S, you still have some information on S.
Okay.
So we want to, throughout the hybrid proof, we want one step which we use this functional encryption to swap out your S to a random value. So like you don't have anything about the S. So that's why the functional encryption is needed.
Okay. Thanks.
But yeah, if you're interested, you can take a look at in our paper, and in there, yeah, we have this more complicated construction and together with. I mean, this looks complicated, but our rate one setting is more complicated.
So low rate is like a constant rate.
Low rate is not considered. Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, so some quick summarize to quickly summarize, right? So we construct so the low rate constructions they support streaming, and the rate one they achieve optimal rates. So there are some possible future directions. So actually, one interesting question I got from the previous audience is that so here we construct rate 1, which is optimal rate, and it requires I/O. So the question is, what if it's a constant rate? Like we only want rate 1/2 or maybe a rate 1/10. Can we do this from a much weaker assumption? Like this, if it's 1/10, it's still a pretty practical scheme. But if we're able to construct a rate 0.1 from a weaker assumption, that will be a good result. Yeah, for now, the low rate they're inverse model. Okay, and yeah, thank you all for coming. And I guess the takeaway point here is that so previously when bounded storage model was first put forward, it was used to do information theoretical constructions. And later on, we show that yeah, by combining these memory bounds together with computational assumptions, we're able to get some very interesting, never before possible results. So yeah, I would encourage you to think about, is there any other way where you can combine computational assumptions together with storage bounds, which can give you cool and new results. Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What about
What about
active security against adversary? If you
Active
combine this encryption with the signature scheme, do you get security?
what is
What if the adversary modifies the communication? Like
modifies? Yeah, we haven't thought about that. Yeah.
Because like if I only block if the adversary only blocks messages and it transmits the same message, you know, you can store stuff in your state and give it to the bigger adversary. You get my point?
Oh, I see. So you're seeing that one? Oh, okay. Yeah, we actually discussed this. So you have so here's one interesting scenario. So if you have one adversary that sort of like received the stream and then sends over the stream to his friend, and his friend later on forwards that stream back to him, and they sort of like they just like passes the stream like through them.
It's simpler. It's just I block the transmission. I'm the adversary. I block the transmission.
Yes.
I keep one part of the message and I send it to the bigger adversary. As STI, I I'm allowed to basically store an STI, right? And give it to the bigger adversary. And then the user will transmit the same message. And I get the second chunk and the third chunk. And
Yeah, I mean, our model doesn't deal with this.
because it's passive security.
Yes.
If you still repeat the message due to randomness, encryptions will be new each time.
No new encryptions, retransmissions of the same ciphertext.
Transmission of the same size. So you're saying that you have some other. Well, I mean, if you think about this, then this smaller adversary is sort of acting as storage for the big adversary, right?
The bigger one.
Yeah, the bigger one. Like the small one is sort of like storing these data for them. So
Yeah.
so like yeah. So the example I was talking about is that you can imagine like you send over a message over to the adversary, right? The adversary sends over the message to the adversary 2, and the adversary 2 sends back a message to the adversary 1, and they sort of like keep the conversation looping between them. And because the network has latency, so they sort of have the whole thing stored on the wire. You know, so this is sort of a more trickier case. Actually, like in system, there's actually a file system called pingfs, just like you just store information by just like on the wire, ongoing information. So this is actually viewed as storage. You actually need to view this as storage.
I see.
Yeah.
And then you need the bound and the
Yeah, exactly. So, okay.
There's one question in the chat.
Yeah.
So the honest party has to store this entire randomness R, but presumably only for a short time.
Yes, correct. I mean, in our like, if you are in a low space stream setting, you can generate this R bit by bit. You don't need to store this entire R in your disk ever. You can just sample it bit by bit and then run the whole thing in an online manner.
And one more question for the RAID 1 incompressible, let's say encryption. So if the storage bound is S, does that mean like a message also has to be of length S?
So if the storage bound is S, that means the ciphertext need to be larger than S.
Yes,
right?
and yeah.
And the message is gonna be almost as large as that. Yes. Okay. In there, like we want the message to be large. So we want to say, given this bound, like how large of a message can you encrypt without like, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. So the question is like, yeah, there we want the message to be as large as possible. We want the scheme to be able to encrypt larger messages. I mean, you can always pad the small messages to a larger size. You can always do that.
Right.
Do all schemes require sending over more data than the size of S?
Yes. Otherwise, you can just record everything down and then just replay the whole thing. Yeah, if the whole communication is less than state ST, then there's no point of like keeping these two separate adversaries, because the first adversary can just record the entire conversation into ST and then send over. The second adversary essentially sees the entire conversation.
Just something like make it like interactive where you don't have to send over something large in state of S.
I mean, there is a variant of interactive model in the bounded storage model. It's there's this paper by Daniel Wicks, Yevgeny, and Woody Koch. It's called like, yeah, essentially they study different variants of bounded storage model. And yeah, we haven't considered this in that model. So. Any other last minute questions?
With the RAID 1 constructions, can you do something that if you have small amount of information, you try to concatenate multiple such messages and get better performance loads?
What do you mean by performance bounds? I mean,
Like you concatenate multiple messages until the whole message.
Like say you have a small message you want to send, and then you just concatenate a whole bunch of messages together to get a huge, larger message, and then you use the RAID 1 setting. Yes, you can do that. Okay, all right. Yeah. Thanks everyone for.
Thank you again.